Hello, and welcome to the meeting of the Rotary E-Club of District 7710 for Tuesday, June 4th, 2019. Thank you for joining us. Katherine McCord is joining us this evening as our guest speaker. Our program chair, Kevin Primus, will introduce Katherine this evening. Kevin?
Yes, tonight we're going to hear from Ryan McCord, who's the project manager for the EPPSA project, which she's going to tell us about tonight. She earned her bachelor's from UNC Chapel Hill in 2018 with a double major in public policy and global studies and a minor in African studies. She's been working with Dr. Jagger, or possibly Yager, at the Fuel Lab, F-U-E-L, which is an acronym lab, on various projects since 2015. Additionally, Ryan has worked with the UNC Water Institute evaluating environmental health in Malawi's healthcare facilities. She's traveled extensively in East and Southern Africa for research and language training. And after her time working on this project, Ryan plans to pursue a graduate degree in public health, which, I don't know, maybe she's already started. I met Ryan when she was a very bright 7th grader, and I got to be her teacher that came in halfway through the school year. And several years later, found out that Ryan had begun to play the beautiful game with one of our other speakers, Nikki Benke, and they've worked together on projects at the Water Institute. So I'm not going to tell you all those stories. I'm going to leave it up to Ryan to introduce herself, bring us more up to speed in the work that she's doing now. So Ryan, thanks a lot for being with us tonight.
Sure. So should I go ahead and, I guess, start sharing my screen? And
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, all right. Can everyone see? Excellent. So thank you for that introduction. As was said, my name is Ryan McCord. I work at UNC Chapel Hill as a project manager at the Carolina Population Center. Carolina Population Center, or CPC, is it's sort of back and forth each year as one of the 2 biggest research centers at UNC, bringing in the most federal funding. It's often competing with the Lineberger Cancer Center. And so I've been working full-time at CPC since I graduated last May, but have been working with Dr. Pam Jagger, who is a faculty fellow at the center since my freshman year of college. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the EPSA project, which I manage, and sort of what the scope of the project is, what our goals are, and some of our current and planned work. We haven't undertaken a lot of the analysis of the data that we're doing as a part of the research yet, so there won't be many results, but hopefully a couple of years from now, maybe I can come back and give an update. So our focus, as I said, is on energy poverty in Southern Africa. Specifically, we are working in Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, which sort of form a band of 3 countries just north of South Africa. Energy poverty is a rather broad term. We did that intentionally because we wanted to ensure that we were studying a topic that could be looked at from a lot of different angles, and that we weren't limiting our scope through just sort of the title of our project alone. Most frequently, energy poverty is defined as either lack of access to electricity or a reliance on what are called traditional fuels for cooking. Traditional fuels usually means wood or wood products. So it could be wood itself, like firewood, or it could be charcoal. And a lot of the energy poverty work that happens in the developing world is related to cook stoves. So 2/3 of the world's population cooks over open fires, as you can see in this picture here. And it's often done indoors. That's, as you can imagine, not good for people's health. It's also bad for the environment, both because trees are being cut down and also pollutants are being emitted when the wood is being burned. And so a lot of the work in this space that's done is through trying to market improved cook stoves to particularly women across the globe, This picture here is from work we were doing in Malawi a couple of years ago and sort of encapsulates one of the big problems related to cook stove work, is that this woman here is very proudly pointing to an improved cook stove, showing it off for the photograph. Yet it is sitting as a prop in her kitchen while she continues to cook over an open fire. So this is one of the many questions that we are considering how to solve as a part of this project. So the PIRE part of Energy Poverty, PIRE, stands for Partners in International Research and Education. This is a program within the National Science Foundation, who's our funder for the project. So this is a 5-year project that generally is working to grow and encourage collaboration between US scientists and students, as well as international scientists and students. And so training is a really important part of any PIRE project. It also has to be interdisciplinary, which I'll talk about later, ours very much is. And also there must be some sort of focused on impact evaluation. So essentially some sort of intervention, whether it's a new technology or a new policy or an education campaign, and figuring out what the impacts of that intervention have been. So within this project, we have quite a group involved. So the project sits at the University of North Carolina. We house the investigators who are sort of more in the social science and public health fields. We work most regularly with our colleagues at NC State University, where we have natural scientists, including forestry professors and a chemist, as well as environmental engineers. So there's several other US-based collaborators and partners as well. I also wanted to highlight that it's an important part of the project for us to have a university based in each of the 3 countries where we do our work to work with us in the project. So in Zambia, that's a Copperbelt University. And Zambia, I'll talk about later on, is where we're doing our work this summer. It's for this sort of project, having partners in country is absolutely necessary to have the work, both for the conceptualization of research projects, but also to carry out the day-to-day tasks when it comes to going into that country and collecting our data. So overall, what we're interested in establishing and doing with this project is to broadly talk about energy and energy poverty in Southern Africa from a really big scale, but also sort of honing in on more specific interventions and projects being undertaken there. We want to train people, students, and professors how to study energy poverty, but also how to work in a really interdisciplinary manner, even in low resource settings. And we also want to sort of foster this collaboration between the institutions here in the US and abroad, which is sort of the groundwork for future activity and future projects. So the training we have available is for students from the undergraduate up through the postdoc level. The core of our student group are these graduate energy poverty fellows. So we have fully funded PhDs available for students at UNC and NC State, and then also we'll have them studying next year at the University of Michigan. So these are students who throughout their entire program at their university and throughout their entire PhD are being trained in how to do this kind of research, and then are going to be producing results as a part of their dissertation work. We have a number of other opportunities, including undergraduate fellowships for undergraduates at several universities across the state, for them to come, be engaged in our research over the summer, and then they actually get to go into the field with us and be a part of the field team while we are in country doing our work. So why did we choose Southern Africa? The biggest reason we chose Southern Africa is because there's just an absolute dearth of literature on this region related to energy work. Anything that's written about Southern Africa primarily focuses on South Africa, and it doesn't often expand up to these 3 countries. They also, in a very overgeneralized way, tell stories to us about energy that pose a really interesting comparative case study. So Malawi is the most reliant on these traditional fuels that I was talking about. So biomass is the term that's being used here on the screen, charcoal as well. So you can see that there is an enormous percentage of the population reliant on these traditional fuels, and it's been that way for decades, and it's likely to stay that way for decades. Zambia has been making a lot of good progress moving people away from these traditional fuels, getting a lot more people electrified and connected to the electrical grid. Zimbabwe has been going in sort of what is perceived as the wrong direction over the past 15 or 20 years. A lot of that has to do with the political situation in Zimbabwe, which has been rather tenuous. They've had a lot of infrastructure breaking down, but essentially the pattern has been going backwards from what we'd want. So these are three countries that demographically and from a forestry and landscape perspective look quite similar, but when you think about their energy situations, they have different stories. And so we thought they would be interesting for us to look at all together. So we have two big themes for our project other than the training component. So I'll just give a really brief overview of what these themes are and just a little bit of information about what our work looks like within the theme. So the first one you can see here is the population and environment dynamics of energy poverty. So the project that we're doing within this, we call our secondary data project. So we're asking really big questions. So what are the spatial and temporal patterns of energy poverty? Is energy poverty something that happens on a really, really local scale? Or is it something that's affecting entire countries or entire regions? And that relates, of course, to the second question as well. And the third, so when you go in with some sort of intervention to try to mitigate energy poverty, how is that being carried out? Is it just affecting people in an immediate area, or is this something that could be broadened to affect people in a larger area? Can it only work in urban areas, or could it work in rural areas as well? So there's a lot of things going on here that we actually have data that already exists in the world that we could start answering these questions, but it's difficult for particularly researchers in the countries we're working on to get access to these data. So we are undertaking a project that a lot of our grad students are working on right now to try to build a secondary data set that could be utilized to answer a lot of these questions we're interested in. So here is essentially a map of what our data set will look like when we're done. So our hope is to take different kinds of data, starting with the core of it, which are household survey data. So these are questionnaires that are asked to households that gather demographic, socioeconomic information, and that sort of thing. And they're nationally representative. So we could have a questionnaire that represents everybody in the country of Zambia, for example. And then we can take other kinds of data like climate data, rainfall, temperature, solar flares. We can take ecological data, land use, land cover, and other sorts of data as well. And there's ways that we are able to essentially merge these different kinds of data into one product that will then, at the end of this project, publish and make available for people to use, so that when people have questions about energy in Southern Africa, they can access our data set and start to analyze the data for themselves and start to answer the questions for themselves. So as a part of this, we have been working on some model papers, as we call them. And so quickly, I'll just give you guys two examples of papers that I'm leading that is utilizing several of these data sources. So the first is on smoke and malaria in Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's a theory that is untested, essentially, that as people are cooking with these traditional fuels, so when they're cooking over an open fire, that the smoke is warding off mosquitoes, so that in some ways people are being protected from mosquito bites and thus are being protected against malaria. And So there's a worry that if we have more and more people starting to use electricity to cook with or gas to cook with, there will be less smoke produced. And so perhaps an unintended consequence is that people will be exposed to malaria at higher rates. So we have a lot of information, a lot of data already out there through this national demographic and health survey. We have some really great malaria data we can use. And we also know that the level of urbanity of a household is really related to the number of mosquitoes that might be around. So there are a lot less mosquitoes in urban areas than rural areas, for example. So we're using these different data sets and we're going to mesh them together to try to get at the answer to this question. Another one that we're doing right now is related to electricity and healthcare facilities in Malawi. So as I'm sure you all know, electricity is very important for health service delivery. It's very hard for a healthcare facility to function with no electricity. In Malawi, over 95% of their electricity comes from hydropower. And that hydropower system fluctuates in its production capacity depending on the season. So in the rainy season, it's really productive. In the dry season, not so much. And so in the dry season, a lot of these healthcare facilities experience blackouts. And so we are trying to use several sources of data to look at this problem and to try to see how often and how many of these facilities are experiencing these blackouts and for how long. And so again, these are just two of, I think we have 6 papers going on right now, and then hopefully there'll be more along the line. The second is technology or incentives for mitigating energy poverty. So this is more our primary data collection. So we are really interested in impacts for this part of our project. So what impacts do technology and behavioral interventions have on environmental and human well-being outcomes? And then different ways that we can look at this, both from a social science perspective, but also from this engineering perspective. And so as a part of this, these impact evaluations, they're essentially these small embedded studies that we'll be doing within the larger project. And these are the ones that we're going to be going to Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia to actually do. It was really important to us that we not establish what exactly we were going to study before the project, because what is interesting and relevant in the energy field changes every day. And so we want to study things that are really happening and that people really think could have an impact on the ground at the time when we're doing the research. So there are a number of things we could study. Oops, I forgot this slide, sorry. This is just a quick overview of when we're going to be doing our work. So as you can see, we're spread out in these 3 countries over the 5 years of the project. Anyway, so back to this, what I was saying is the kinds of things that we could study as a part of the project. We can study anything essentially related to energy and energy poverty. So this could be a company that's promoting solar home systems to light homes in rural areas of these countries. It could be small scale grids. So this is essentially a community-based electricity grid that could be powered with solar. It could be powered with hydro. We could study improved cook stoves or essentially anything else. But the key part of these impact evaluations is that we, as the research team, are not going in and creating some sort of intervention. It's not like a clinical trial with medication where we're giving some groups some meds and others not. We are partnering with already existing organizations. So it could be a company that is selling a new technology. It could be the government that's doing an education and awareness campaign. We're partnering with them to study something, again, that's already happening, that's really happening, because we want to know the impacts of those things. And so our first of our impact evaluations is happening this summer in Zambia. So we are studying 2 improved cook stove companies. We decided to study 2 companies because they are both operating within the urban sort of fringe, the outer urban areas of Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia. And they're marketing their product these two different stoves to a very similar population. So they're targeting sort of middle-class people in what we call the peri-urban area of Lusaka. Both companies have different theories about why people might want their stoves and what they think the benefits and the impacts of the stoves will be. So I'm actually going to start with the bottom one. This green stove here is a stove that's being marketed by a company called Vitalite. And so I guess an important background detail is that everybody in Lusaka is cooking with charcoal. Charcoal is the fuel for cooking, and they cook with a really inefficient tin stove that does not combust in any sort of efficient way. So this green stove that you can see here also uses charcoal, but is meant to be really, really efficient. So their theory is if we can get this stove into the hands of customers in Lusaka and they just start using it, they'll realize they're saving, they claim, 80% of charcoal per week. So they're using 80% less charcoal every single week. So as you can imagine, that will save them money, that will save them time going to the market. And so they're really, really sold on this. And then interesting for us as well is if they're really reducing charcoal by this much and they're managed to spread their product across the country, if you scale that up, the reductions in charcoal demand, it has an implication for the number of trees that are getting cut down in the country. The other stove that we're studying is this nice red stove up top. It's called the Mimimoto stove, and it's being marketed by the company Supermoto. So this stove uses a different kind of fuel. It uses these little wood pellets that are usually made from sawdust or agricultural offcuts. And they're produced in a factory in northern Zambia. Now, what's really interesting about these pellet stoves, particularly for people that are interested in public health and the health burden of cooking, is that they are the first wood-based fuel product that has been found to burn as clean as an electric or a gas cooker. So one of the big problems here is that when you're trying to get people to cook with cleaner technologies, it's really hard to make a jump from charcoal to electricity. So Supermoto is still selling a product that uses wood for cooking, but the technology within this stove is so advanced that it manages to combust in an almost perfectly clean way. So this stove has potential to have really beneficial health impacts, but there's a concern here that it's going to be a big jump. Not only are we asking people to use a new kind of stove technology, but we're also asking them to use a new fuel type. So we're going to have the exact same study design for both of these stove companies. And the study will last 2 years. So we'll collect baseline data this year, and then we'll go back at the same time next summer to the same households. And then we'll have 2 years of information to study the impacts. So here's where the interdisciplinary piece of the story comes in, just an overview of the kinds of data collection we're doing. So the first is actually going on right now, is life cycle analysis. So we have a forest biomaterials chemist at NC State and a couple of grad students there who are interested in sort of the cradle to grave impact of these sorts of products. So for example, this green stove down here, there's potential for it to reduce the amount of trees cut down if it were to be taken to scale, but the stove itself is produced in China. And so there's environmental implications for a stove that's being shipped from China, and how do you balance that with the potential of how much wood it could save in Zambia? So these are just questions we want to be considering, so we have a team working on that. So the rest of the team will leave in about 2 weeks to go do the rest of this list. The first and sort of the core of this work is the household survey. So this is a questionnaire we'll ask households to gather, again, just sort of demographic information, socioeconomic information, lots of details about their cooking practices, about their income, their expenditures, how many stoves they have, what they cook with, what they cook on those different stoves. Essentially anything we could ever want to know about what they're currently doing in their households and what they're currently cooking with. We also have our engineering team to come in with these last three things. So when you burn charcoal in a stove, the main toxin that is released from the combustion of charcoal is carbon monoxide. So we have the capacity with these little gadgets our engineering friends have made for us to monitor how the personal exposure to carbon monoxide. So we can measure exactly how much people are currently being exposed to carbon monoxide. And then say, for example, they switch to this pellet stove, we can go back next year and see if that's been reduced. And then also similar types of monitoring for particulate matter. So that's sort of like the soot that's coming off of stoves when you burn wood. That's also bad to inhale into your lungs, so we can measure that as well. Lastly, we can do this stove use monitoring. So in the simplest of terms, it's a gadget that sticks onto the side of a stove, and it can tell us exactly when and for how long a stove heats up. So we'll leave those on there for an entire year, and we'll know how often people are using stoves, for how long each cooking event is. It also gives us really good information on if people are using more than one kind of stove in their house, which is called stove stacking. So in each household where we're doing this monitoring, we'll put the stove use monitors onto up to 3 different stoves. It's very common for somebody, for example, to buy this pellet stove and use it for some meals, but continue to use their charcoal stove to cook meat, for example. Even here, we choose to cook meat on charcoal for those of us who eat it, because there's a perception that it tastes better. So we can get all that kind of information and put it together. Just to finish up, I wanted to give you guys an idea of what kinds of things we're going to be able to learn from our analysis when this is all said and done. So the first is savings. So fuel and money savings are very tightly linked. So if people are using less charcoal when they're cooking, that's less charcoal used overall, so that's less trees essentially being chopped down. It also could save the family money, which is money that could then be reallocated to something else. There's also potential for time savings, both from not having to go to the market as often to get charcoal, but also charcoal really, really dirties pots. And women spend a lot of their time washing pots when they get dirtied with charcoal. So if you're cooking with a cleaner fuel, you might spend less time washing pots. And again, you could be doing other things at that time. The second is exposure reduction. So reduced exposure to these pollutants that I was mentioning, in particular carbon monoxide. So the main symptoms of low-level carbon monoxide poisoning are dizziness, fatigue, forgetfulness, and short-term memory loss. And so as a part of our household questionnaire, we actually have a module that does some cognitive testing. So word recall and digit span testing. So trying to remember numbers in a certain order and that sort of thing that we can match up with the exposure levels from the carbon monoxide to try to get a little bit more clinical information about cognitive functioning. We also have self-reported health information. So that can be the same sort of cognitive information, but also information about burns, which of course happen more often when you're using stoves that aren't sort of enclosed the way the ones you saw were. And then lastly, we can get a lot of information about usage. So with these stove use monitors, we'll know if people are using just one stove type or if they're using several. We'll know how often they're using the stoves. We also will know if they stop using the stoves. And then when we go back next year, we can try to find out if there was some sort of pattern to when or why people stopped using the stoves, and if something can be adjusted going forward. So that is a very quick overview of what the whole project is about, but also a little bit about the work that we're planning this summer. I know that was sort of a lot of information all at once, but that is what I have for you all, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Here's our website here as well if you want to learn more and not quite such a rushed time frame.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was fascinating. And we'll certainly open up the floor to any questions that someone may have. Just a question for you. How resistant and I don't know if resistant is the correct word, but I guess it's how open are the general population in these countries to changing the way they do things with cooking? Are they?
It's a good question, and I would flag that we have some anthropologists on our team who wanna be thinking about things just like that. I think when you're talking about involving new cooking technologies, you often find that you'll have an easier time trying to talk people into something new in urban areas. That's for a couple of reasons. One, they're just more exposed to new technologies on a more frequent basis, and they have more money usually. So for them, it's not as big of an ask to try something new. They're used to trying new things. The other piece is that what they're using for their fuel, for the stoves, charcoal, they're buying. They have to go to the market and they have to purchase it. In rural areas, you have people who are less exposed to these new technologies. Additionally, what they're using for their fuel is firewood. It's wood that they're going into the forest and they're collecting it for free. And so it's a much harder, I think, and many people agree, it's a much harder sell, I think, in rural areas than it is urban areas. Rural areas have often been the focus of this kind of research, so I'm really interested to see what we find working with an urban population this summer.
And one for other question, Ryan. And this probably is more meaningful on a percentage basis, but how much of the income of, say, a family is used to purchase the fuel, the coal, or that they have to buy to cook their food?
So it depends, again, well, I'll just speak to urban families since they're the ones that are buying. It can often be upwards of 15 or 20% of their income that's going to the fuel purchases, which that's mostly for sort of the lower end income or families in urban areas. But yeah, it's definitely a substantial proportion of their income that they're having to spend.
That is significant. Thank you so much. Anyone have questions? I'm sure, please unmute and ask your questions.
Ryan, this is Gene Perry. That was a great presentation, actually, and you're right. You could probably go on for another hour or so. But my question is, who will be or the immediate beneficiary of all this research? Because throughout this, I did not hear a connection between the research and having local government, take a leading role in making the necessary changes that should be made.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's a several step process. And the first step, of course, is just for us to get in there and collect our data. We have, as in the later years of our project, in each of the countries where we're going to be working, we have policy and stakeholder meetings planned, so that we hope by that point in time, so 2-3 years from now, we'll have all of our data collected. We'll have it written up in a really approachable fashion that then we have our local collaborators, so our local research partners and professors that will help us set up these meetings and make sure that people are in the room that actually need to be there so that these changes might be made. But also we're working with these companies. And so these companies think that their products are having some sort of social impact. And so we'll be able to come to these companies with feedback to say, maybe you were right about this part, but maybe you should be focusing a little bit differently with what you're doing here. And so I think it's both looking at things from a smaller scale, but then, yes, absolutely, at the end of the day, we want to be talking to the people who can make sort of bigger change within these countries.
And one more. There were a couple of things that struck me. One was the charcoal issue, which I understand is a very big problem in Africa. in that in some cases that's a major source of income for some people who go out there and actually collect this charcoal.
Absolutely.
And the other is, you mentioned the stoves, the two stoves.
Mm-hmm.
Now that would be, in my mind, some sort of a transitional period because you're going to eventually move away from that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I'll address the charcoal issue first. In Zambia in particular, Zambia is a country that is particularly dependent on charcoal. And there's not actually good data on it, but people will throw out statistics like 50 or 60% of Zambians have an investment in some part of the charcoal value chain. So whether it's charcoal production or selling at the markets. It's a very important livelihood for many people in Zambia. And by no means is there an expectation that something like these stove projects are going to cut off those livelihoods for people. We also want to consider in our projects what alternative livelihoods are for charcoal producers. That is not a good, when you're producing charcoal, you're also exposed to those same pollutants. And so we're thinking about ways to have, one of the things I mentioned that we could study is these sort of improved charcoal kilns. So it's still producing charcoal, but it's in a more efficient manner. There's also been efforts to regulate charcoal production in Zambia. It's actually illegal to do without a permit, but the government doesn't enforce it. And so the vast majority, I would say over 95% of the charcoal that's sold and that people are using is illegally produced. So there are ways to approach the problems related to charcoal and the production of charcoal without, I think, just cutting people off from this source of their livelihood. And then your other question was related to the stoves and sort of whether this is a step towards something else. Certainly, I think the stove that still uses a charcoal, we see as potentially some people's first experience with what we will call an efficient cook stove. And so for them, maybe they start with trying to use a new stove, but still using the same fuel. And then maybe after they get comfortable with that, they could shift towards something like that red stove that uses pellets. That's a new stove. It's still using wood fuel, but it burns in a really clean way. Of course, at the end of the day, we'd love everyone to be using electricity or gas. But the reality of the situation in a country like Zambia is that nobody is selling gas for cooking at any sort of large scale right now. The electricity in the country is extraordinarily expensive, and it's also unreliable because they don't have the capacity to produce electricity to meet the demand. And so I think, yes, we would love everybody at some point to get to sort of these later stage cooking technologies like electricity. But right now, we are trying to find something that works as a sort of happy waiting place. And a lot of people in this community think that this pellet stove is it. They think that if we can get people cooking with this pellet stove, which is still a wood fuel, but doesn't have some of the same health burdens, that maybe that would be a good holding pattern for people until we can get them to sort of the next thing.
That was a good answer. Brian, this is Kevin. And Jean, thanks for those questions. Those are things I hadn't been thinking about. So one of the questions, if I may ask, is what is the capacity that you're sensing for your university partners in these countries to expand, some of the, I guess, engineering and technical capacity of both people and production to where what you're learning can be the solutions that come up can be engineered there in country, maybe in, 5 to 10 to 20 years, more capacity is built. And then also wondering about how that intersects with media and education to kind of get the word out information-wise, but also potentially influence people to be more motivated to think about the intersection of human health and energy and what could be done as solutions emerge little by little. So I guess in other words, you're coming up with, you're doing research or finding things out. What's the capacity regionally and locally to engage their community, and what do we do next? And kind of a cycle of, as you're finding things out, getting the word out, and then having local people and local institutions get more and more deeply involved in the discussion and the solutions. That was a long question.
No, I think I followed most of it, hopefully. Remind me if I don't address all the parts of your question. But to start with, so the partners we're working with locally from a research perspective are also research institutions in the country. And so for them, a lot of it is learning about how to work on this sort of big scale research project. Very difficult for African universities in particular to get access to this kind of funding to do these large scale research projects. And so it's great experience for them to be able to be in this project. And of course, it's critical for us to have a sort of local support. And then from there, there's so much potential to collaborate on future research projects. So it's more capacity building and training for future research collaborations with the research partners. In terms of the implementing partners, as we call them, so in this case, it's the two stove companies, a critical part of the conversation leading up to this kind of research project is, what do these research partners want out of the work? And for the two that we're working with, they want to know both what the impacts of the stove are, which is of course what we want to know. They also want to know if they're the ways that they're trying to sell the stoves are working, essentially the marketing strategies and the payment plans and these sorts of things. So we can give them that sort of information after we do the research, which they can then adapt into their sales model and hopefully learn more about how they can take these products to a larger scale. Both companies are really interested in trying to localize the production of the stoves. And I mean, a lot of that is profit oriented because it's really expensive for them to get stoves shipped in. But also they value having locally produced products. They know that Zambians want Zambian produced products. They're facing some issues with that because, for example, the charcoal stove has a cast iron sort of shell on the inside, and you can't get cast iron in Zambia. So they're thinking, okay, well, how could we maybe produce the other parts in Zambia and then limit the amount that we're shipping in? So these are definitely discussions that are being had by several of the different people that we're working with. There's also a really interesting project happening with the company that's doing the pellets. So as I mentioned, well, I don't know if I mentioned this, but it's a little bit of a more expensive stove. And so right now, it's not really accessible to lower income households. And they've been trying to figure out how they might deal with that problem. And one of the ideas they have to making it available to agriculture-based rural households is essentially a barter system. So the way you produce the pellets, which are used for the fuel, is either through sawdust or agricultural offcuts. So they have a couple of plans set up with farmers to get the agricultural offcuts from their farm, which would just be waste for the farmers. They don't do anything with them except burn them. And they take those to their pellet factory, and in return, these farmers get the stove and fuel. So they're trying to be really creative about how to make this accessible and how to educate people about the options that are available about this stove. And in terms of this sort of broader message about health and energy, it's a tricky one. We know that being aware of the health burden of cooking is an important factor in determining whether or not somebody wants to adopt a clean cooking technology, but there's major limits to that. The primary one being cost, right? So even if you know that down the line, your health might suffer because you're cooking over an open fire. If you need to feed your family today, then you're not going to be worried about the health, 10 years from now. And so that's a big problem. And again, these are why people are trying to come up with these creative solutions of how to get these products into the hands of people who want them and know that they would help them without having to deal with the cost problem. I think that's everything. Were there other questions in there I missed?
That was great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ryan. This was just a wonderful presentation, and we really thank you for taking time to spend with our club this evening. With that, I'm going to stop recording for a second.